The bell rang at exactly 3:15 p.m., the same way it had every school day, that autumn-sharp metallic echoing down the long hallway of Gracemont Middle School. But that day the sound seemed to hang in the air a little too long, like it knew what was about to happen. The children didn't notice, of course. They burst from their seats in a flurry of voices scraping chairs, and the slap of sneakers on linoleum outside. The air carried the cool bite of mid-October, sharp enough to bring a faint blush to the cheeks. The trees along the school's edge were halfway through their autumn, undressing gold rust and red scattered like confetti on the cracked sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed lazily, its low drone blending with the squeals of children tasting freedom for the day. Emily and Claire walked side by side, their identical navy blue coats buttoned all the way to their collars. Emily's hair, sunlight brown, was tied back in a neat ponytail. Claire wore hers loose, falling across her shoulders in waves that caught the late-day light. To the casual eye, they were mirror images, but those who knew them could tell the difference. Emily walked with a slightly longer stride, always a step ahead. Claire lingered, eyes drawn to details. Others missed the curve of a cloud, the way rainwater pooled in the cracks of the pavement, a spider mending its web in the low branches by the school fence. They weren't in a hurry. Fridays were their favorite. Homework could wait until Saturday morning. And there was talk of their father making caramel apples that night. Emily was carrying a plastic grocery bag with a library book tucked inside. She had checked it out during lunch. The title wasn't visible, but she clutched it like a treasure. Claire carried her sketchbook, the corners of the pages curling from weeks of being taken everywhere. As they crossed the parking lot, Mrs. Alder, their homeroom teacher, waved from her old red station wagon. "See you Monday, girls," she called out, her voice carrying over the wind. Emily waved back with both hands. Claire smiled softly, but her gaze had already shifted to something across the street. The old Wexler house stood just beyond the school fence, its windows clouded with years of dust, its porch sagging at one corner. No one had lived there in over a decade, at least not officially, Claire thought. She saw a curtain twitch upstairs. Just for a moment, she nudged Emily. "Did you see that?" Emily glanced over, but shook her head. "Probably the wind." They reached the crossing where Mr. Hall, the town's volunteer crossing guard, held up his stop sign. He had worked that corner for 20 years, and he always remembered names. "Emily, Claire, bundle up tonight. They say the frost's coming in early," he said, his breath visible in the cool air. Past the crosswalk, the neighborhood opened into a stretch of narrow streets lined with houses that all seemed to have been painted the same faded shade of cream. In one driveway, a boy their age bounced a basketball, the rhythmic thump, 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 chasing them down the block until it faded. Emily chattered about something she'd read in science class, about how some stars were already dead by the time their light reached Earth. "It's like we're looking at ghosts," she said, her eyes bright with the idea. Claire didn't answer right away. She was looking down, tracing her shoe across a crack in the sidewalk where tiny weeds had taken root. Halfway home, they passed Mrs. Callahan's porch, where the elderly woman sat with her knitting, a mug of tea steaming beside her. "Careful near the Mill Road," she called, her voice carrying a note of warning it hadn't carried before. The twins nodded politely, though neither had any reason to go that way. From there, the air grew quieter, as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. The twins' route home would take them another 10 minutes, past the old oak, where kids carved their initials, past the corner store with the soda machine that sometimes ate your coins, and yet later, when people tried to recall exactly where they'd been seen after Mrs. Callahan's porch, no one could agree. Some swore they saw the girls by the corner store laughing over candy. Others insisted they saw them turning down Wexler Street, where the windows of the abandoned boarding house stared blankly over the sidewalk like blind eyes. For now, in this last ordinary moment, their world was small and safe. Emily adjusted her bag on her shoulder. Claire glanced at the sky, where the first faint blush of sunset had begun to stain the horizon. A single crow passed overhead, its shadow skimming over them for just a heartbeat before vanishing into the deeper blue above. Years later, when people remembered Emily and Claire from that afternoon, they'd remember the simplest things: the matching coats, the way Claire's hair caught the light, the echo of their laughter somewhere between the schoolyard and the street that led them home. No one realized that the air itself had shifted that day, that somewhere out of sight their paths had already been marked, their story already set in motion. By the time the twins disappeared from view, the schoolyard was empty, the bell's echo long gone. The wind picked up scattering leaves across the cracked pavement. Somewhere far down the road, a door closed softly, and 35 years later, when Claire's diary was pulled from behind a wall in their childhood home, The first page would be dated October 14, 1988, the day of the last bell. Gracemont, Pennsylvania in 1988 was the kind of town where time moved with the stubbornness of an old grandfather clock ticking forward, yes, but never in a hurry. It sat nestled between two low ridges of wooded hills, its streets laid out in a neat grid that hadn't changed in half a century. The population hovered just under 5,000, most of them born there, most of them staying. Outsiders came through only if they were lost or chasing some forgotten back road on a Sunday drive. On paper, it was the kind of place where children could ride their bikes until dusk without fear, where the corner store clerk knew your family by name, where summer carnivals in the high school parking lot were still the highlight of the year. But under its clean facade, Gracemont had an instinct for silence. People waved politely, shared apple pies at church fundraisers, and asked about your family, but they didn't ask the wrong questions. The houses were mostly two-story clapboards, painted in weather-faded blues and creams. Their porches lined with wicker chairs that were rarely used. Curtains were drawn earlier than in most towns, and on some streets, even in daylight, the windows seemed to watch you without revealing what was inside. It wasn't unfriendly exactly. It was as if the town had agreed long ago that some things were better left unseen. There was a single main street, Hawthorne Avenue, where the diner, post office, hardware store, and the one-block library stood shoulder to shoulder like siblings in an old family. Photograph above the library's arched doorway. The brick was chipped in the shape of a missing plaque. No one could quite remember what had been engraved there, or perhaps they didn't care. To those who had grown up in Gracemont, could tell you stories that had slipped between the cracks of official history. There was the night in '63 when 3 farm horses broke loose and wandered into town, their hooves clattering down Main Street in the moonlight, or the winter in '71 when the river froze solid enough for boys to drag their father's truck halfway across before it cracked like glass. But every so often the stories turned darker. The rumor of a girl who vanished in 1959 and was found 2 weeks later, though no one ever said where she'd been. The tale of the old boarding house by the Mill Road, closed since the 1940s, where lights were sometimes seen flickering at night despite the lack of electricity. For the most part, though, life went on without open confrontation. People prided themselves on minding their own business. If you heard something strange in the woods behind your house at night, you shut the window, drew the curtain, and pretended you hadn't. It was in this environment that Emily and Claire grew up. 2 bright sparks in a place that could feel at times like it lived in perpetual dusk. Their home stood near the eastern edge of town, where the houses began to space out and the streetlights grew fewer. Their father worked as a machinist at the paper mill 2 towns over, their mother a part-time seamstress, made dresses that seemed plucked from another era, lace collars, tiny pearl buttons, garments that neighbors would later remember as too fine for every day. Where teachers at Gracemont Middle School remembered the twins differently. Mr. Breyer, their history teacher, described Emily as fearless with her hand in the air, like she was already arguing a case in court. Claire, by contrast, rarely spoke up in class, but when she did, it was with an observation so precise it made the room go quiet. Mrs. Alder, their homeroom teacher, kept a watercolor painting Claire had given her the year before, a small, delicate rendering of the oak tree in front of the school, each leaf brushed with impossible care. Outside of school, the girls were known for walking everywhere together, always in step. They had no brothers or sisters, and their friends, though fond of them, often said it was like the twins existed in their own private language. A quick glance, a half smile, and they seemed to understand each other perfectly. And yet, despite their visibility, there were things no one in town could claim to know about them. Where exactly they liked to explore on their weekend walks, who Emily had been writing letters to that she never mailed, why Claire had once been seen in the library archives leafing through old town records with a frown. She didn't explain. Gracemont had a way of folding such curiosities into its larger habit of quiet. If something didn't fit neatly into the frame, people simply looked away. On that October afternoon in 1988, as Emily and Claire left school for the last time, Gracemont was in the midst of one of its picture-perfect autumns. Pumpkins sat on porches, their carved faces still fresh. The maples lining Hawthorne Avenue were alight with color, as if the season had set them aflame, but the air held a faint sharpness, the kind that warned of early frost. Mrs. Callahan, who lived 3 houses down from the twins, later said she remembered the sound of their laughter drifting down the block, mingling with the distant whistle of the freight train that passed through twice a day. She also remembered closing her front window a few minutes later, not because it was cold, but because she thought she heard a man's voice calling faintly from somewhere. She couldn't place most in town would dismiss such recollections as tricks of the wind, but when you look at the history of Gracemont, its closed curtains, its boarded up houses, its unspoken rules, you begin to see why no one pushed to find out. What that voice might have been for 35 years after that afternoon, the twins' absence would remain one of the town's few open wounds, though even that in time was dressed in the bandages of silence. People remembered the way Emily smiled or the tilt of Claire's head when she was listening, but they didn't speak, at least not openly, about the way the town itself seemed to close in after they were gone, as though the streets had decided to guard a secret that belonged to them alone. Gracemont was, and perhaps still is, a place where the windows are shut before the sun has fully set in, where some doors once closed are never meant to be opened again. The last bell was still ringing in memory when Emily and Claire stepped off the school grounds and onto the cracked pavement of Willow Street. Their matching navy coats swayed, with each step the sleeves brushing just enough to keep them tethered in the autumn chill. Behind them, the school's chain-link fence rattled lightly in the wind, and the shouts of other children grew faint with distance. This was their usual walk, 20 minutes from school to home, though they'd often stretch it to 30 with detours to feed the ducks at Miller's Pond or peek into the window of the Curiosity Shop, a cramped store that smelled of cedar and mothballs. But today their pace was unhurried for a different reason. Claire had something to show Amelia's secret she'd been holding in for days. They took their first turn at the corner where the convenience store sat, its window painted with faded ads for root beer and baseball cards. The door swung open as they passed, releasing a puff of warm, sugary air. A boy in a varsity jacket stepped out with a soda in hand and nodded politely at them. Emily nodded back. Claire barely noticed. She was tracing the outline of something in her sketchbook with the tip of her thumb halfway down the block. Mr. Hall, the crossing guard, was already in position. He was a tall man with a sun-browned face and a thick mustache, always wearing the same navy cap, no matter the season. Emily, Claire, he said with a friendly nod as he held up his stop sign. Stay warm tonight, frost coming early. Emily smiled. We will. Claire glanced up, offering a quiet thank you before stepping off the curb. The wind was stronger on the next street, carrying with it the faint smell of the paper mill. 20 miles away, the maple trees lining the road leaned under the invisible push, their leaves scraping together like whispers. They passed Mrs. Callahan's porch, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. You girls, be careful, she called, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. And don't go near the mill road. Emily laughed under her breath. We're not going near the mill road, she whispered to Claire. Claire's eyes didn't leave the ground. We might, she said so softly Emily thought she'd misheard. From there, their route split into two possible paths: straight ahead toward the familiar streets that would take them home in 10 minutes, or left onto Wexler Street, a narrower road that wound past older houses, some of them long abandoned. Witnesses would later disagree about which way they when, according to Mrs. Callahan, they turned left. According to the boy with the basketball on Elm Street, they went straight. And then there was the store clerk who swore he saw them laughing together at the gumball machine. Not long after, the police would draw lines on maps, circle intersections, and try to make the pieces fit, but the timeline would always be fractured. For now, we see them through the lens of memory, two sisters moving in step under a sky already tinged with the faint rose of sunset. They passed the old oak tree where their initials are carved into the bark, a secret only they and the tree know. A train whistle sounds in the distance, low and mournful, a sound that will later become impossible to hear without thinking of them. Emily talks about her science book again, about stars that died before the dinosaurs, but whose light is only reaching Earth now. It's like the past pretending to be the present, she says, looking straight ahead. Claire finally smiles, or maybe it's the future trying to remind us something's coming. They reach the corner where the old boarding house sits in the shadow of its own decay. The windows are dark, but the front steps are still intact, the paint peeling in thin curls like shavings from a pencil. Claire slows her steps. Emily notices Claire. Claire tilts her head toward the house. It's in there. What is the secret? Emily's laugh is soft but uneasy. You're not serious? Claire doesn't answer. Her eyes are fixed on the upstairs window, the same one she thought she saw a curtain move behind. The week before this is the last point where anyone can agree on their presence. A neighbor 2 houses down remembers seeing 2 figures at the corner, one slightly ahead of the other before they turned the corner out of sight, but the direction they turned is disputed. After that, the trail dissolves. Later that evening, when their parents began retracing their daughter's usual paths, they would find nothing to suggest which way they had Ganino dropped belongings. No shoe prints distinguishable from the dozens left by neighborhood children, but in the telling of this last walk small fragments take on new weight. Mrs. Callahan's warning about the Mill Road, Claire's cryptic promise of a secret, the fact that Emily's library book checked out during lunch was never found, not in her school desk, not in her room, not in any search that followed in daylight. The streets of Gracemont seemed small and safe, but on that October afternoon, somewhere between the school and home, those streets swallowed the twins whole, and no one, not for decades, could say where they went. At 4:30 p.m., the sun had begun to sink behind the low ridge west of town, spilling the streets in a warm golden light that made the world look safe. In the twins' kitchen, their mother stirred a pot of chili on the stove, glancing occasionally at the clock. The girls usually walked in no later than 340. Sometimes they stopped to see friends or went to the corner store, but they were always home by now. By 4:45, the sky had shifted to a deeper orange. The chili was simmering low. Their father's pickup rumbled into the driveway. He came in with the smell of machine oil on his coat, greeted his wife, and asked where the girls were. She shrugged, smiling faintly, but with a note of unease. Probably took the long way, she said, but the glance they exchanged said something else entirely. It isn't like them at 5:10. She called Mrs. Callahan. The old woman said she'd seen them pass her porch, but didn't know where they'd gone after. At 520, the phone calls multiplied, first to the McAllister family down the block, then to the Phelps boy who sometimes walked with them. No one had seen them since just after school. By 5:45, the light outside was almost gone. The October air turned sharper, the kind that seeps in under door frames. Their father grabbed his flashlight from the hall closet, and the two of them started walking the most likely routes the girls could have taken. They split off, took the straight path home from school. She went toward Wexler Street. Their voices called out into the cooling air, echoing slightly against the narrow houses. The chili was still on the stove when the first darkness settled. By 6:15, the police were called. The Gracemont Police Department was small, 6 officers in total, 1 dispatcher. The man who answered the phone tried to sound calm, but his clipped responses carried a hint of urgency. A missing child was rare in Gracemont. 2 at once was unheard of. Within half an hour, the first officer arrived, his patrol car headlights cutting across the front lawn. He spoke briefly to the parents before heading toward the school route. Radio clipped to his shoulder. Neighbors began to gather on their porches, watching, whispering. By 700, the street was alive with motion. Flashlights bobbed along sidewalks, cutting thin cones of light into the dark. Dogs barked from behind fences, restless with the noise. Every so often, someone would think they saw a movement, a figure ducking behind a tree, a shadow at the end of an alley, but it was always nothing. Inside the twins' bedroom, the officers looked for any sign. They had planned to leave bags packed, notes left behind, but found nothing. Their beds were neatly made, their clothes folded away. On Claire's desk sat her sketchbook, open to a half-finished drawing of a maple leaf. On Emily's side table was a glass of water, still half full from that morning. By 8:15, the temperature had dropped sharply. Frost had begun to form in the grass, crunching under the boots of the searchers. The sound of the train's night whistle carried faintly from the hills, a long, low wail that seemed to stretch the silence between voices. The parents walked the streets themselves until their breath came out in sharp clouds, their eyes scanning every porch, every yard. Once the mother thought she saw movement in the upstairs window of the old boarding house, but when she blinked, it was gone. At 9:30, the search widened. Cars drove slowly along the Mill Road, their headlights sweeping across empty fields. 1 officer waded through knee-high grass to check the old oak grove. Another shined his light into the mouth of the culvert where the creek ran under Willow Street. Nothing. By 1015, the searchers' voices had grown quieter, as if they were all thinking the same unspoken thought, that the girls were no longer anywhere they could reach by foot. But no one said it aloud. Back at the house, the kitchen light cast a warm rectangle onto the porch. The chili was still on the stove, now cooled to room temperature. 2 bowls and spoons had been set out hours earlier, untouched. At 1100, the police chief, a thick-set man with deep lines around his eyes, arrived in person. He sat at the kitchen table with the parents, speaking in low tones. The dispatcher took more calls from townsfolk who thought they had seen 2 figures in various parts of town, none of them matching up. By midnight, the streets were nearly empty. Most of the volunteers had gone home, promising to return at first light. The parents refused to stop. The father walked the Mill Road, twice more, sweeping his flashlight across the dark fields. The mother stood at the edge of Wexler Street staring toward the old boarding house until her eyes blurred from the cold. The twins were not found that night, nor the next day, nor in any of the days that followed. But in that first night, something in Gracemont shifted. The easy rhythm of the town's evenings was broken. The quiet no longer felt safe, it felt watchful. Later, when asked about those first hours, the police chief admitted something Head never said in public. Before, it felt wrong from the start, he said, not just that they were gone, the air, the whole town. It felt like whatever had already happened hours before we even knew to look. And from that night on, the parents never heard the school's afternoon bell the same way again. Morning in Gracemont broke pale and cold, the kind of cold that made the grass crunch underfoot and left a glaze of frost on car windshields. The town woke early that Saturday, not to the smell of coffee or the hum of radios, but to the sound of boots on pavement and the low murmur of voices outside. By 7 o'clock a.m., search teams had formed in the school parking lot. Volunteers wore thick coats and mismatched gloves, holding thermoses of coffee they barely sipped. The police chief stood on the tailgate of a truck, giving instructions through his breath, which drifted like smoke. Were covering a 2-mile radius from the school. He said fields, woods, alleys, sheds, check everything well marked, cleared areas with orange tape. The twins' parents were their faces drawn tight from a sleepless night. The mother clutched a scarf of Claire's in her hands, as if holding it might anchor her to something solid. The father stood beside her, his jaw locked, scanning every face in the crowd. The first sweep began at 730 lines of people moved slowly across the frost-silvered fields, their boots leaving dark prints in the grass. The air was filled with the snap of branches, the rustle of leaves, the occasional shout. When someone thought they'd found something, at one point a volunteer called out. Everyone converged, hearts pounding. In the shallow ditch along Willow Street lay a single navy blue mitten. The fabric was damp from frost, and the cuff was stretched as if it had been pulled off in a hurry. The mother confirmed it looked like one Claire had worn, but she wasn't certain it was a common style sold in the general store. Still, the mitten was bagged and tagged, carried away like it might hold the first thread of truth. By mid-morning, the woods behind the old boarding house had been searched twice. The house itself was checked from the outside, boarded windows, doors nailed shut, but no one had permission to enter. Yet one officer swore he heard something faint inside, like the dragging of furniture across the floor. But when he circled back with another, the sound had stopped. The creek was searched next, officers and hip waders moving slowly through the dark water. A handful of volunteers worked the banks, eyes scanning for anything that didn't belong. They found no thing, no shoes, no torn fabric, no disturbed mud. The water was calm, untroubled. At the edge of Miller's Pond, a diver in a black wetsuit moved slowly through the murky shallows, his flashlight cutting thin beams through the green-brown water. When he surfaced, he shook his head. The only things they'd found were a rusted bicycle frame and a glass jar filled with pennies. The search moved toward the mill road. By noon, where the frost was melting under the weak sun, the tall grass swayed hissing in the wind, hiding whatever small lives moved beneath it. Searchers found animal tracks, an old tire, and a child's marble half buried in the dirt, none of it tied to Emily or Claire. Throughout the day, the twins' parents followed the search teams, watching, asking questions, scanning the ground themselves. At one point, the mother wandered into the shade of the old oak grove, standing so still that an officer had to call her name twice before she turned. She later said she thought she heard someone humming a soft, lilting melody just at the edge of hearing, but when she listened harder, it was gone. By 3 o'clock p.m., frustration began to settle in. The orange tape fluttered from tree branches and fence posts, marking areas cleared with no results. The volunteers' voices grew quieter, the cold creeping back in as the sun began to sink. Around 4:15, a police dog named Ranger caught a scent near the far end of Wexler Street. The handler urged him forward, the dog pulling hard toward the old boarding house. But the trail stopped abruptly at the back fence, where a tangle of brambles made further progress impossible. Without cutting tools, the handler swore he felt the dog's whole body tense, if something beyond the fence wasn't right. But with daylight fading, they marked the spot for the next day and moved on. The search officially paused at sunset. The volunteers returned to the school parking lot, their faces pinched from cold and disappointment. Coffee was poured, hands were clapped for warmth, but the air was heavy. No one wanted to be the first to say it, but everyone knew after a full day they were no closer to finding Emily and Claire than they had been the night before. That evening, the police held a short press gathering in front of the station. The chief thanked the volunteers, confirmed that no conclusive evidence had been found and promised that the search would continue at first light. When asked about the mitten, he said it was being analyzed and declined to comment further. Inside their home, the twins' parents sat in the quiet kitchen, the scarf still in the mother's lap, the chili from the night before had been thrown out. The bowls were still clean, untouched. Upstairs, the girls' bedroom door remained open, as if they might walk in at any moment, but the silence was wrong. It wasn't the stillness of a house waiting for its family. It was heavier, like the air had settled into a shape it would never quite leave. And outside, Gracemont's streets lay under the cold October moon, empty, but not unobserved. Somewhere in that emptiness, the truth was still out there, just beyond the reach of flashlights and search maps. By the third day, the search had narrowed not in area, but in spirit. The maps were still being marked, the fields still combed, but beneath it all the talk had shifted from where to why. It began quietly, whispered between neighbors over back fences, exchanged in half-finished sentences at the diner. Some believed the twins had run away, though no one could point to a reason why. They had no record of trouble at school, no history of fights with their parents there. Home life, by all outward appearances, was steady, modest, but loving. Others swore it had to be an abduction. That theory carried its own fractures. Some pointed to strangers passing through on the highway, others to someone local. A handful of people couldn't shake the idea that whoever took the girls didn't need a car, because they were never meant to leave Gracemont alive. By the end of that week, the police had quietly questioned nearly every adult male in town. Some interviews lasted minutes, others stretched into hours, with voices low and the blinds drawn. Officially, no suspects were named. Unofficially, names floated through the community like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to grab. And then there were the older stories, the kind that only surfaced when tragedy pulled them out of the deep. Mrs. Callahan's warning about the Mill Road had come back to people's minds. That stretch of cracked asphalt had been avoided by children for generations, not because of traffic, but because of what loomed near. It's in the old boarding house. The place had been shuttered since the late 1940s after a fire gutted part of the east wing. For years afterward, it sat in legal limbo, passed from one disinterested owner to the next. The boarding house was built of dark brick, its windows like rows of hollow eyes, its roofline warped by decades of neglect. People said you could still smell the fire if you stood close enough to the walls. Local lore around the boarding house was messy, shifting with the tellers. Some claimed it had been used during the war to house children evacuated from cities. Others swore it had been a halfway home for troubled youth in the 30s, and that a handful of those children had simply disappeared. There was talk of tunnels under the foundation, once used to store coal for the furnace, later blocked off. When the house closed, the police had checked the perimeter that first weekend. They found no thing, no footprints in the dirt beyond the fence, no sign anyone had been inside. Still, the boarding house persisted in people's minds the way a shadow remains, even when you close your eyes. Beyond that, there were other theories. A retired mill worker named Carl Benton told anyone who'd listened that had seen the twins near the train tracks at dusk that Friday. They were walking fast, he said, not scared, like they were going somewhere they knew they weren't supposed to be. His statement didn't match the timing of other sightings, but it lodged in the collective imagination anyway. Some whispered about the old Wexler family, whose crumbling Victorian still stood near the school. The last surviving member, a man in his 70s, lived alone and was rarely seen except at night. No one could tie him to the girls directly, but the absence of proof didn't slow the speculation. Then there was the diary rumor, something the police denied at the time, but would later prove to be only half false. A teenager claimed had heard from his older sister, who babysat for the twins once, that Claire had been keeping a special journal. In it, she supposedly wrote about hearing tapping at her bedroom wall at night, like someone trying to get her attention. She thought it was Emily playing tricks, the babysitter allegedly said, but Emily swore it wasn't her. Whether the diary existed or not, the idea of it spread through Gracemont like wildfire, feeding every darker possibility. By the end of that month, the theories had settled into three main camps: runaways fueled by sightings that couldn't be confirmed, and the belief that maybe they'd been lured by someone offering an adventure; local crime, the idea that someone in town had taken them, someone trusted enough not to raise alarms; the boarding house, not a theory so much as a magnet for fear, drawing all the other ideas toward it. The official investigation refused to name any single theory, but those closest to the case felt something beyond the procedural silence. Former Officer Martin Haskins, who walked the Mill Road that first night, put it plainly. Years later, there was this heaviness, like the town was holding its breath, and not just from worry, from knowing, like it already knew where those girls went, and it knew we'd never get to them in time. And so the shadows in Gracemont grew, not just the physical ones cast by its narrow streets and shuttered windows, but the kind that live in people's minds, the unspoken agreements about what can be asked and what can't. Winter came early that year. By mid-November of 1988, the leaves were gone, the streets dusted with the first snow, and the twins' posters, bright white at first, were already curling at the edges, their colors fading under the cold. The first month after Emily and Claire's disappearance had been restless, full of movement, search teams combing the fields, neighbors walking the mill road with flashlights, late-night interviews in the police station's cramped office. But as the weeks wore on with no breakthrough, that urgency thinned. People still cared, but they began to care quietly, privately, as though speaking about it too often might invite the same fate. The twins' parents kept their routines for a while, her sewing, his long shifts at the paper mill, but each day the space in their home felt larger, emptier. Emily's bed remained neatly made, the pillowcase washed weekly. Claire's desk stayed as it was, sketchbook open, a pencil resting diagonally across the page. Even the books on their shared shelf seemed to lean toward each other for company. By spring of 1989, the official investigation had slowed to a crawl. The police chief still stopped by the house every few weeks to check in, but it became harder for him to meet their eyes. Leads that once seemed promising were quietly dropped. Tips from the public dwindled. The girls' names slipped out of conversation at the diner, replaced by talk of weather, high school sports, and the price of gas for the parents. The absence became a shape they learned to live around. On Sundays, they sat in the same church pew as always, but left the space beside them empty. On Emily and Claire's birthdays, their mother baked a cake anyway, cutting 2 slices and leaving them on the kitchen counter until the frosting dried and cracked. The house itself began to change in ways they didn't fully notice. The air in the twins' bedroom was cooler, even in summer. The floorboards in the hallway creaked louder at night, sometimes in the quiet hours. After midnight, one of them would think they heard soft footsteps upstairs, too light to be their own, but they never spoke about it to each other. Years passed. The paper mill cut jobs, the hardware store closed. Gracemont's population shrank as younger families moved away. The town's paint faded. The old boarding house remained untouched, its windows darker, the boards on its doors more warped with each passing season. The case of the missing twin sisters became a cautionary tale told to children in vague, hushed tones. Don't wander off after school, don't go near the mill road. Their names were kept alive more as a warning than a memory. By the early 2000s, only the parents and a small circle of older townsfolk still marked the anniversary. Each October, they'd light 2 candles in the church, their flames flickering as though struggling to stay alive in the draft. The twins' parents aged in that house. Her hair silvered, his shoulders stooped. Still, they never moved, never repainted the bedroom, never changed the route they walked to the market. People said they were waiting, though no one could agree on what for. In 2016, the father died quietly in his sleep. His funeral was small. The mother stayed in the house alone, still wearing her wedding ring, still setting 2 places at the table each night. A neighbor recalled seeing her once in late autumn standing in the yard staring toward the old boarding house. Her hands were bare in the cold. She stayed there for a long time. By 2021, she was gone. The house stood empty, the windows clouded from the inside. The yard overgrown. A for sale sign went up the next spring. For 35 years, the story of Emily and Claire remained exactly a story, something you could tell in under 2 minutes. If asked, 2 girls walked home from school one Friday in 1988. They never made it home. What no one could have predicted, what would ripple through Gracemont like the first cold wind before a storm, was that the story wasn't finished. It was just waiting for a wall to be torn open. It was early spring of 2023 when the for sale sign in front of 214 Willow Street finally came down. The lawn had grown wild in the years since the mother passed. Patches of crabgrass, the bare skeletons of what had once been rose bushes. The shutters hung crooked, and the porch steps sagged in the middle like a tired spine. The buyers were a young couple from Harrisburg, Matthew and Lena, drawn not by the house's history, but by its price. They wanted a project, something they could put their hands on and turn into their own. Gracemont was quiet, cheaper than the city, and surrounded by the kind of rolling hills Lena imagined raising children in. The day they got the keys, the air was warm, and the neighborhood still. Matthew walked through the rooms with a notepad, jotting measurements. Lena followed behind with her phone, taking before pictures. The house smelled faintly of dust and something older, like paper shut away in boxes. In the twins' old bedroom, the sunlight fell in a pale rectangle across the floor. The Wallpaper was faded yellow patterned with small blue flowers that had almost disappeared over time. Two narrow beds stood against opposite walls, stripped bare. A desk sat under the window, its surface scratched from years of use. "This will be the nursery, Lena," said her voice echoing in the empty space. Matthew nodded. "Well, strip the wallpaper, take this wall down to the studs, maybe even open it into the hallway." Work began the following week. They pulled up carpet, scraped old paint, and took down sagging shelves. On the third day, Matthew started dismantling the bedroom wall that ran parallel to the hallway. The plaster came off in brittle sheets, revealing the horizontal slats beneath. It was while prying off the lower section of slats that his crowbar hit hollow, not just the usual gap between studs. This sounded deeper. He tapped again, listening. "Hollow, Lena," he called. "Come here a second." They cleared more plaster until a small square opening, appeared no more than a foot high, framed by two studs. Inside was darkness, the air stale and cool. Dust drifted into the sunlight in lazy spirals. Matthew slid his hand in and felt something soft but firm. He pulled it out slowly, a cloth bundle wrapped tightly in what looked like an old pillowcase. The fabric was yellowed and fragile, tied shut with twine that snapped easily when pulled. Inside was a book. It was a diary, fabric bound, its once pale cover now blotched with age. The front bore no name, only the faint outline of a handprint, as though someone had once held it often enough to leave their mark in the grime. When Matthew opened it, the pages crackled. The handwriting inside was neat, looping, unmistakably young. In the upper corner of the first page, in careful block letters, was a name: Claire Whitford. Lena's breath caught. "These were the girls," she said quietly, "the ones who she didn't finish." The early entries were dated from late summer 1988, mundane notes about school projects, classmates, the weather. The handwriting was steady, the tone cheerful, but as the pages turned, small shifts appeared, sentences cut short, mentions of hearing tapping on her wall at night, of seeing a man in the yard standing still like a scarecrow. The final entry was dated October 14th, 1988. The ink was slightly smudged, as if the pen had been pressed harder. It read, "We are going tonight. Emily says, well, see the secret. I think I already know what it is." And then nothing. They stopped reading. The air in the room felt suddenly close, heavy. Matthew placed the diary carefully on the desk. Neither spoke for a long moment. By that evening, the police were at the house. Officers photographed the wall, the cavity, the bundle. The diary was bagged as evidence, though its discovery immediately stirred old wounds in Gracemont. Word spread fast. Within 24 hours, the case that had lain dormant for 35 years was alive again. Neighbors came by, some under the guise of welcome, others unable to resist the pull of history stirring. One older man told Matthew in a low voice that the room had always felt wrong, that when he was a boy had spent a night there on a sleepover and had woken to the sound of something, Simeon, breathing on the other side of the wall. The couple tried to continue their renovations, but the mood of the house had changed. Lena swore she sometimes heard faint scratching in the walls late at night, though Matthew told her it was just the sound of old wood settling down at the county archives. Journalists began pulling old case files. The boarding house's name surfaced again, so did inconsistencies in the original witness statements, and everywhere in quiet conversations at the diner and in the aisles of the grocery store, the same question was asked: why had Claire's diary been hidden inside the walls of her own home, and why was the last line written as though she knew exactly what would happen? The diary, once catalogued as evidence, was eventually copied in full for the investigation. What emerged was not a confession nor a direct account of the girl's disappearance, but something far more unsettling: a gradual descent in tone, a breadcrumb trail of small moments that, strung together, seemed to point toward a shadow moving closer each day. The first entries were warm, almost painfully ordinary. August 29th, 1988. Emily and I got the same seat on the bus this year. She says it's because she's older by 3 minutes and gets first pick, but she let me sit by the window anyway. I drew a tree while she read about black holes. September 3rd, 1988. Mrs. Alder gave me a gold star on my art project. Emily got one for her science essay. Dad says we're two sides of the same coin, but I think maybe we're different coins in the same pocket. For nearly 2 weeks, the diary held these little windows into school life, homework, complaints, sketches of maple leaves, notes about neighbors' dogs. But then, without warning, a subtle fracture appeared. September 15th, 1988. Heard tapping on my wall again. Last night, like before, it was 3 taps, then quiet, then 3 taps again. Emily swears it wasn't her. September 17th, 1988. The tapping came back this time. It was slower. I put my ear to the wall and thought I heard humming. Couldn't make out the tune. The handwriting on these entries was slightly tighter, the loops less generous, the sketches in the margins were darker, pressed harder into the paper, mostly trees without leaves, a house with windows shaded black. By late September, the entries began to reference something else entirely. September 28th, 1988, there's a man who stands at the fence sometimes. He doesn't move, just watches. His hat is pulled low, so I can't see his face. Emily says, I'm imagining it. But today I saw him in the reflection of the kitchen window. October 1st, 1988, dream the man was in my room. I woke up to find my sketchbook on the floor. I never leave it there from here. The tone of the diary began to pull inward like someone lowering their voice. October 6th, 1988, Emily says she heard it too, not tapping this time, scratching like nails on wood. She thinks it's coming from the old boarding house. I told her the sound doesn't travel that far. She says it does if you're listening the right way. October 8th, 1988, we walked past the boarding house today. I counted 6 windows upstairs, but one of them was dark in a different way, like there was nothing behind it at all. The entries between October 9th and October 12th were brief, almost rushed. Mentions of homework, of Mrs. Callahan's knitting, of the way the air smelled sharp like frost waiting, but each had some fragment tucked inside, a line about seeing the hat again, or a note that the humming stopped. When I looked, then came the final 2 entries, the ones investigators and journalists alike would return to again and again. October 13th, 1988, Emily says she found something. She won't tell me what, not yet, says we should go tomorrow after school before it gets dark. She promises it's safe, but she looked away when she said it. October 14th, 1988, we are going tonight. Emily says, well, see, the secret, I think I already know what it is. The handwriting on that last page was noticeably different. The letters leaned forward as though written in haste. The final lines period was heavier than any other in the diary, a dot pressed so firmly into the paper it nearly tore through. After that, nothing. The next page was blank save for the faint imprint of the pen from the page before. The police analysts who reviewed the diary tried to extract meaning from the vague descriptions, the tapping, the humming, the man at the fence, but without corroborating evidence. It was still just words in a book written by a child. And yet there were patterns worth noting. For instance, the tapping was almost always described as happening at night, but never at the same time. The man was never seen directly, only from a distance or in reflections, and the secret was mentioned only twice, both within 48 hours of the girls vanishing. What unsettled people most was the intimacy of the voice. Claire hadn't been writing for anyone but herself. She hadn't been crafting a story or leaving a deliberate trail. This was the unfiltered record of her days, her fears, her trust in her sister, and it ended mid-step, as though she had simply stood up and walked away from the page. When excerpts from the diary were eventually leaked to the public, Gracemont's collective quiet cracked just a little. People who had said nothing for years began sharing things they'd kept to themselves. Strange noises near the mill road, figures glimpsed in the boarding house windows long after it was abandoned, the uneasy feeling that the town itself seemed to close in when certain names were spoken aloud. The twins' mother had always claimed the girls were too smart, too grounded to run away without telling someone. After reading the diary, even those who doubted her began to wonder, what if they hadn't run away? What if they had followed something they thought they understood, something they thought was safe? When Claire's diary became public knowledge, the Gracemont Police Department officially reopened the case. The dusty boxes of evidence from 1988 were pulled from storage, photographs yellowed at the edges, handwritten witness statements on brittle paper, objects sealed in plastic bags with faded labels. What had once been considered cold was now classified as active. Modern forensic tools offered a chance to re-examine what had been overlooked. The mitten found on the second day of the search was tested. 4 touch DNA soil samples from the mill road were analyzed for traces of decomposition. Even after 35 years, the results came back inconclusive, not enough to confirm or deny anything. The diary entries mentioning tapping and the man at the fence became focal points. Investigators mapped every possible line of sight from the twins' yard, charting where someone could have stood without being noticed. They found that the far corner of the yard nearest to the property line, toward Wexler Street, offered a clear view of the bedroom window if you knew where to stand. And then there was the matter of the secret. The final entries in Claire's diary seemed to point toward a specific destination, somewhere the girls could reach on foot after school, somewhere tied to the sounds they'd been hearing for weeks. One location fit too well to ignore: the old boarding house. Though it had been searched from the outside in 1988, no one had ever entered it during the initial investigation. The ownership dispute at the time had required a warrant, and by the time paperwork was approved, the search focus had shifted. For decades it remained sealed. That changed in late summer 2023. With the case reopened, police obtained legal access and brought in a forensic team. The air inside was thick with the scent of rot and dust, the floors coated in decades of debris, paint peeled in long strips from the walls. The upstairs matched the room's 6 windows, one of them blacked out from the inside. In that room, investigators found signs that someone had once stayed there long after the official closure. An old mattress pushed against the wall, rusted food tins in a corner, and most unsettling of all, a child's shoe small enough to have belonged to either Emily or Claire. The basement was worse. Narrow stairs descended into a stone-walled chamber lined with rusting pipes. In one corner was a boarded-over doorway, its planks warped and splintered. Behind it, ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of shallow tunnels. No one could say for certain what they had been used for, coal storage perhaps, or storm runoff, but they extended beyond the property line toward Willow Street. Theories bloomed overnight. Some speculated that the girls had been lured there under the promise of the secret Emily mentioned. Others believed they had discovered the tunnels themselves, following the sounds they'd heard, only to become trapped or intercepted by someone who already knew the place well. Retired Detective Alan Price, who had worked the original case, admitted something had never said publicly before. "I always thought it came back to that building, the timing, the sightings, the way people shut down. When you mentioned it, it all fit. But we didn't have the tools or the permission to get inside back then, and maybe part of me didn't want to see what was really in there, even with the new evidencia. The tunnels, the proximity, the investigation hit familiar walls. The tunnels were partially collapsed, too dangerous to fully explore without costly excavation. DNA from the shoe was degraded past identification, and without a direct link, everything remained circumstantial. Still, the boarding house had reclaimed its place at the center of Gracemont's unease, the sight of investigators hauling out evidence boxes under the flicker of their portable floodlights became an image people couldn't forget. The official stance was careful. "We are pursuing multiple leads, but off the record," one investigator admitted. If this wasn't the end of the road for Emily and Claire, it was where the road bent hard. It is late October in Gracemont again. 35 years have passed, but the air still carries that same dry chill. The same brittle scent of fallen leaves. The streets look different. Some houses freshly painted, others left to sag under the weight of time, but certain things remain unchanged. The curve of Willow Street, the narrow sidewalk that runs past Mrs. Callahan's old porch, the long shadow of the oak tree near the school, its bark etched with names no one remembers carving. The narrator's voice is quiet now, almost conspiratorial, as the camera follows a slow walk along the route the twins took that Friday in 1988 hay race, where they crossed with Mr. Hall, holding up his stop sign, his breath visible in the cold air. Hay race, the corner store, now boarded up, where the smell of penny candy once drifted through the door. Hay race, the stretch where witnesses disagreed, straight toward home or left onto Wexler Street. The space between those two directions feels heavier than it should, like a choice that still hangs unanswered in the air. Past the Mill Road, the old boarding house still stands. Its brickwork is darker, now eaten by ivy that creeps up toward the roof. The windows are empty, except for the one blacked-out pane upstairs. That room, investigators discovered, still smells faintly of smoke from the fire decades before, smoke that clings to stone and would long after the flames are gone. The house is fenced off now, but from the street, you can still see the upstairs landing through the cracked front door. The camera lingers there, letting the silence settle, until even the background noise of birds seems to fade away. From here, the walk continues toward 214 Willow Street. The couple who found the diary moved out shortly after the investigation reopened. The house sits vacant again, its windows clouded from within. The front steps bowing slightly in the twins' old bedroom. The square opening in the wall has been sealed over with new plaster painted in a neutral cream. There is no trace of where the diary rested for decades, but in the county archive behind glass, the diary lies open to its final page. The ink has faded, but the words remain clear. "We are going tonight," Emily says. "Well, see, the secret, I think I already know what it is." Visitors often pause there, leaning in, as though the page might offer more if they look long enough. Some swear they can make out faint pencil impressions on the blank page after it, as though another sentence was begun and erased. The twins' parents never saw the diary while They were alive. It arrived too late for answers, too late to pull the past forward into something they could hold, but perhaps that was always going to be the shape of this story, a question suspended, never allowed to touch the ground. On certain autumn evenings when the wind moves just right down the narrow streets, neighbors say they hear the sound of footsteps, do sets in sync, moving somewhere just ahead, never close enough to see. It might just be the mind pulling tricks from old grief, or it might be that the road home for Emily and Claire was never entirely empty again. It arrived in mid-November, 2 weeks after the production crew finished filming in Gracemont, a plain manila envelope, no return address, postmarked from a neighboring county. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was cramped, uneven, as though written in haste or by someone not accustomed to writing at length. The first line read simply, "You're looking in the right place, but you're not asking the right person," the letter claimed. The writer had lived in Gracemont in the late 80s. They did not give their name, only initials, RJ. They said they had known Emily and Claire from a distance and had seen them on the day they disappeared. They weren't running away, and they weren't alone. The one in front kept looking over her shoulder, not scared, checking like she was making sure the other one was still behind her. The letter described them turning down a narrow lane, not marked on any map, a lane you can't see unless you already know where it is. The writer claimed this lane connected to the back of the old boarding house property through a gap in the fence that had been there for years. Then came the most unsettling part. One heard one of them laughing. I know that sounds wrong, but it wasn't a scared laugh. It was the kind you make when you've been waiting for something a long time, and now you finally get to see it. They didn't wave, but they saw me, and then they were gone. The letter ended abruptly. You'll never find them in the tunnels, not because they're not there, because they're deeper than anyone knows, and some of them aren't meant to be opened. There was no signature beyond the initials. The police examined the letter for fingerprints, none. The postmark gave them only the vaguest location. Attempts to identify RJ came up empty for the production team. It posed a choice: include the letter in the documentary or hold it back in case it was a hoax. In the end, they decided to read it aloud in the final minutes, withholding the most specific details at the request of investigators. The closing shot is of the diary's last page. Under the archive glass, the words "frozen in time." The voiceover repeats the letter's final line: "Some of them aren't meant to be opened," and then the screen goes black.